Hello, my name is Alan Mulhern. I'm the director of the Quest series, and today we're going to examine the human prospect. There is an evolving world crisis on multiple fronts. We address it therefore in a broad manner using many disciplines, from the economics on the one hand to even the metaphysical on the other. No single dimension or discipline can capture it alone, and therefore this interdisciplinary perspective is needed. The lecture is divided into 4 parts. The first part looks at the human prospect as it was framed in pre-capitalist societies. We choose Christianity as an example, whereby of course the human prospect was framed in terms of an afterlife chiefly, and material factors were downplayed. We then move on to the scientific enlightenment, a massive movement shift in human consciousness in the 16th and 17th century in Europe and increasingly in Northern Europe as the Industrial Revolution advanced. In this scientific enlightenment, the human prospect is increasingly framed in terms of material factors rather than spiritual or religious. For example, Adam Smith could frame it in terms of economics and understand the forces and the principles and the determinants of economic well-being. Malthus, on the other hand, looked to a contradiction in the system, in which he saw a contradiction or a limit to expanding population with the available food supplies, which would always be less than the expanding population needed. So an inevitable material contradiction developed in the system, a viewpoint we still use to this day. So the human prospect is framed in terms of material factors increasingly as the scientific revolution advances. Indeed, human happiness is framed in terms of a series of material factors, for example, economic well-being, political security or freedom, in terms of individual rights, and so on. We hope you enjoy this first part of the lecture on the human prospect. Pre-capitalism, of course, the human prospect was largely framed in spiritual or religious terms. We have the great religions of the world. You see some of the symbols of them there, of Hinduism and Christianity and Judaism and so on, which framed a world consciousness and for humanity the condition that they could expect. In Christianity there was an afterlife, for example. The prospect here on earth was not meant to be wealthy or pleasant. It's supposed to be a vale of tears, and it was in the next life that you could get your just rewards. And many religions therefore were like this and framed the human prospect in terms of the revealed knowledge that they had. However, if we fast forward to the time of the scientific revolution and then forward into the late 18th century, 19th century, we find materialist philosophers in economics, political economy as it was called, framing the human condition in quite different terms. For example, if there was famine, it wasn't delivered by God. The human prospect, if there was disease, was something that could be tackled perhaps by science and wasn't just a visitation of divine wrath. So as secular knowledge, non-religious knowledge becomes to be the centre of science and the new paradigm, we find thinkers like Malthus framing the first visions of the human condition in terms of political economy and the times ahead. Malthus is famous for his theory of population, which he wrote in 1798. And in it, he gave a simple formula which drove his whole vision of economics, which was very interesting and quite profound. But a simple formula was that population growth increased geometrically, 2, 4, and so on, whereas growth of food production took place arithmetically, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. If these growth rates of population and the food supply, the underlying sustenance base for humanity, were out of kilter, then the results would be some way in which there'd be a natural equilibrium process would restore the equilibrium or balance. Famine, wars and disease would come. Now, it's been traditional in economics to look down on Malthus and say, oh, he got it wrong, didn't he? Look at our productivity and look at our technology. Isn't it wonderful? And hasn't it increased food supply and so on? And yes, food supplies have increased. But if we take Malthus's general proposition that the natural sustenance of the earth in a wider sense than food production, our natural foundation is limited and is not infinite, then human population and human economic growth will naturally rise at some point against the limits of available resources. That's a simple proposition from Malthus, which he drove home in his economics, and as far as he could see it, explained the famines and diseases of his time, not God-given, but given by understandable, simple economic forces. And so too today, it seems to me, we have a Malthusian vision. If it's not in terms of resources, limited resources, we're finding ever new resources or ever new means of exploiting the Earth's resources, particularly through artificial intelligence and expanding our energy supplies. It's not limited energy. Malthus, it was limited food. For many people in the 1960s, it was limited energy resources. Oil will run out. Natural resources will run out. And if that's not true, either of those, but it's true in some wider sense, that the Earth is got limited capacity in terms of its, for example, its temperature levels, in terms of water supplies, in terms of animal populations and species, which are in serious decline, particularly climate change, but there's many other factors affecting the global ecological crisis. Then clearly we've become far more aware than the past of the limits of the sustaining factors, but they're externalized, of what we depend upon for our growth and for our, indeed for our survival. So Malthus was the first on the scene to really bring that awareness to it. Western scientific enlightenment, generally reason and science can lead to an ordered existence, was a belief system. And indeed, the history of the belief of populations in the Western world conformed to the idea that science, economic growth, democracies, reason could lead to an ordered existence, and on top of that, capitalism can produce wealth. So democracy can produce order, the state can produce order, people's wishes can be represented in an orderly way, capitalism can produce wealth, and democracy can therefore bring the freedom and the wealth that people presumably crave. And this generally would be the foundation for human happiness. So human happiness is no longer defined in terms or envisaged in terms of enlightenment or in terms of an afterlife or in terms of a sinless existence or being in accord with God's commandments. It's seen in terms of materialist values to do with freedom, pleasure, economic growth, security, health, economic well-being. And the West has pursued that beyond most people's wildest dreams and achieved some of it. John Stuart Mill, just a few figures from the classical political economy of the 19th century. He wrote in 1848, at the time of the crash of the boom period, the Minsky moment, came in 1848 with the revolutions, which punctured the boom that had surrounded the railway boom, the expansion of steel, ocean liners, new transport systems around the world. 1848 was the midpoint of that boom, a crash. The prospects for humanity under capitalism for him were that the production system of capitalism needed to be not interfered with. That in terms of free markets, as much as possible, that should be encouraged. But the distributional arrangements that you make from the benefits of capitalism, from the profits of capitalism, can be altered. And he made this most solid argument in the middle of the 19th century, and he was the first economist to really do so, convincingly, that capitalism would benefit if there were substantial reforms that get people higher wages, for example, much as we've just discussed in relation to China, that this argument was going on in mid-19th century in Britain. Higher wages for the working class would ultimately benefit capitalism, would create more demand, would have people more invested in democracy and so on. So he pointed out that a myriad of reforms were necessary and they had to be done by the state. And the state had to take a far more active view and wasn't just the watchman of the system, the lawmaker, if something goes wrong with the contract, or the defender of the realm, but had to be actively involved in the system with the distributional arrangements. And this philosophy of John Stuart Mill basically altered people's perceptions radically, because most people had believed in free markets in Britain up to that point. But suddenly the middle classes and the upper classes began to realise that capitalism needed substantial modification and reform was necessary in the system. Reform had been taking place in Britain, even in relationship to slavery in the world markets. Remember that Britain was the first to abolish slavery legally. So the British were becoming reformist in relationship to the capitalist system. State interference is absolutely necessary for this to take place. So production should be left alone as much as possible, but distribution should actually be altered by the state. For example, he didn't quite envisage the welfare state, but the foundations of that vision were certainly in John Stuart Mill. And for that, taxation had to take place, remove from people's profits and excess incomes, distribute the money so that welfare states and some happiness or some security at least for the majority of the population should take place. Something that is generally accepted on a global level now, isn't it? That has to take place to some extent. But John Stuart Mill was the first to say that as recently as 1848, because before that it did not exist. It was a free market system and people were left to starve or have disease and were just left in the gutter. And that was globally as far as the British system was concerned. In the Irish famine, the Americans, a lot of Irish in America, during the famine, which was the worst in modern times and hasn't been exceeded in terms of the amount of the population that starved to death. And boats were sent from America with corn by the American Irish. They raised the money and numerous boats arrived off, and they were off the coast of Cork in Southern Ireland. And the master of the Irish situation at that time, the English master, was called Trevelyan. And it's called, and we still have the word in Ireland, Trevelyan's corn. And what Trevelyan did, that was his surname, he ordered that none of these boats should be allowed to offload and distribute corn to the Irish population. So they starved. And the reason he gave was a free market principle based upon Ricardo and Smith and classical political economy. He said that if you give free corn to the Irish people, that'll prevent the local production of corn and therefore destroy local production. Therefore, you must let this naturally take place, this famine or this harsh situation, and therefore the production arrangements will eventually take place so that Ireland will be able to feed itself. It's called Trevelyan's corn, and it's gone down into Irish songs and Irish history as a terrible event. The belief in free markets was universal in Britain up to the time of people like John Stuart Mill, who had to argue for reform. Karl Marx in the 1860s, of course, and Engels had dealt with and visited the English working classes, Engels particularly in Manchester, who wrote The Conditions of the English Working Classes, which were appalling in the Industrial Revolution. Disease, famine, prostitution, no morals, family systems in disarray. It was very low wages, tremendous insecurity. The working class were really in a bad situation, and that was why John Stuart Mill and later people like Karl Marx and Engels had such an impact, because the conditions of the working class were so terrible. He said the working class is condemned to immiserization, growing misery, and would have their wages driven down solidly over time. We've seen that's not true. Wages could rise, inequality could be addressed, and distributional arrangements could be affected. Reforms could take place in the system, and the system was flexible enough to learn from all of this. It took time, but the system did learn how to get more accommodative and more democratic systems in operation. However, a different future for humanity is possible, argued Karl Marx. The prospects for humanity could be brighter. That turned out to be a terrible mistake in the Russian and Chinese revolutions. Yes, there have been attempts, active attempts in the Chinese and Russian and other revolutions to alter the prospects for humanity as a whole, haven't there? And some of them have been utterly disastrous. Why? Not only have the economies of these systems not worked, but totalitarianism has been brutal in the extreme.